how does each part of the craniofacial complex actually grow? Where does all this bone formation and growth take place?
All right, so let's start with the cranial vault. You know, that dome-shaped part of your skull that protects your brain?
Right, the helmet of the body.
Exactly. And you know those fontanelles, those soft spots on a baby's head? They're actually crucial during birth.
Because they let those skull bones kind of overlap, right?
Yeah.
Makes it easier to, pass through the birth canal.
Exactly. But once the brain starts growing, those fontanelles gradually close up, and the sutures become those primary growth sites for the cranial vault.
And as the brain grows, it pushes on those bones, almost like you're inflating a balloon.
Exactly. To keep up with all that expansion, new bone is being laid down at those sutures. Remember, intramembranous ossification?
Yeah, like adding layers to that clay sculpture.
That's it. And that ensures the skull can keep up with the brain, which is growing like crazy in those first couple of years. But here's the kicker. While all that expansion is happening, some bone is also being removed from the inside of the skull. It's a process called resorption.
So bone is being added and removed at the same time. Why bother removing it?
Well, it might seem counterintuitive, but it's crucial. It's all about efficiency. Removing some bone makes sure the skull doesn't get too thick and heavy.
It's like the body is constantly fine-tuning things as it goes.
Yeah.
Now, what about the cranial base? It's like the foundation for the entire skull, right?
Perfect analogy. And unlike the cranial vault, which expands in all directions, the cranial base, that lengthens.
So it's like extending out almost like a telescope.
Exactly. And that lengthening, that's endochondral ossification at work, starting with that cartilage model that gets replaced by bone.
And that's where those synchondroses come in, right? Those growth plates we talked about earlier.
Bingo. They're like specialized growth centers within the cranial base, and they're pushing those bones apart, letting the skull lengthen.
Okay, so we've got the cranial vault expanding, the cranial base lengthening. It's like watching a time-lapse video of a building going up.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the face itself? Let's start with the maxilla, the upper jaw. It's crazy how much it grows to make room for our adult teeth.
The maxilla is interesting because it actually grows downward and forward, kind of away from the cranial base, almost like it's sliding along a track.
So instead of growing outward, like the cranium, it's moving forward and down, creating space for those permanent teeth as they erupt.
And that downward and forward growth, that's mostly intramembranous ossification driven by, you guessed it, those soft tissues again.
So the tongue, the cheeks, they're all helping to shape the maxilla.
Exactly. It's why it's so important for kids to develop good oral habits early on, you know? Because things like thumb sucking or using a pacifier for too long, that can actually mess with those natural forces on the maxilla and could lead to orthodontic problems later on.
It's a good reminder that these habits, they really can have a big impact.
Okay, let's move on to the mandible, that lower jaw. That one's got a particularly complex growth pattern, doesn't it? It does. Remember how we were talking about the mandible relying on both endochondral and intramembranous ossification? Well, that's what gives it that distinct shape.
It's like it's got the best of both worlds.
Right. So you've got that mandibular condyle, our little cartilaginous growth center we talked about earlier. That's the main engine driving the lower jaw forward and downward.
And while it's happening, intramembranous ossification is adding bone to the back of the jaw, making room for the molars. It's amazing how synchronized it all is.
It really is. And we can't forget about the influence of, you guessed it, those soft tissues. The muscles we use to chew, our tongue, all of that exerts forces on the mandible, further shaping it.
Wow, it really drives home the point that form and function are inseparable, Our actions are shaping our bones, and our bones are shaping our actions.
Exactly. And this dance between bone formation, resorption, and all these external forces, it's not just happening in our faces. It's happening throughout our entire bodies. It really speaks to just how amazingly complex and adaptable we are.
It really makes you appreciate all those things we take for granted, like taking a bite of an apple or just smiling.
It really is amazing. We think about growth as just, getting bigger, but it's so much more than that.
Right. Our faces don't just enlarge. It's like they're transforming in 3 dimensions at once.
Right.
Width, length, height.
And the crazy thing is there's actually a pattern to this 3D growth.
Oh, really? Tell me more. I love a good pattern.
So usually the width of our faces, the transverse dimension, for you science nerds out there, that finishes going first, usually around age 10 to 12 or so.
Okay, so our faces, they kind of widen out first, setting the stage for everything else.
Exactly. Then comes the length, that's the anterior-posterior dimension, from front to back, and that usually wraps up around 14 to 16.
Got it. So we get wider, then longer, then
And then finally, it's height's turn, the vertical dimension. That one keeps going the longest, often into early adulthood.
it's like a relay race, each dimension taking its turn to lead the pack.
Yeah,
But like you said before, everyone's growth journey is a little different, right?
for sure. These are just averages. Some folks might hit those growth milestones a little earlier, some a little later. And that's where, having a good orthodontist really comes in handy.
Because they can look at your individual growth patterns, figure out what's what, and make a plan from there.
Exactly. They're like growth detectives. They'll take x-rays, dental impressions, and use all that knowledge to create the best treatment plan for you.
So it's not just about straightening teeth. It's about understanding those growth patterns, knowing when to intervene, when to maybe let things play out a bit.
It's like they're choreographing this intricate dance between your teeth, your bones, those soft tissues, everything. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
It really is.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been amazing. We went from microscopic cells to the entire structure of the face, and it's all thanks to you and, of course, Mental Dental over on YouTube.
It's been my pleasure. Hopefully everyone listening has a little more appreciation for all the amazing stuff happening behind the scenes to shape their smiles.
And hey, if you're ever wondering when the right time is to see an orthodontist for yourself or your kiddos, well, that's what they're there for. They can assess your growth, figure out the best time to intervene, because timing is everything.
Couldn't agree more. Be proactive, ask questions, and don't be afraid to geek out a little about all the amazing stuff happening in your mouth. It's more interesting than you think.
And there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the world of craniofacial growth and development. We just scratched the surface today, but hopefully this sparked some curiosity. Gave you a new appreciation for that incredible journey, from baby teeth to a healthy adult smile.
Until next time.